They're like, here's Dad. You don't interrupt someone when they're reading a book. So anyway, this lady, Alice Baldwin, wrote The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. It's a book worth reading. In it, she writes, "It was not left to the rulers to be oppressive and arbitrary. God, from whom their power ultimately was derived, had limited that power." Okay? This is a chapter in my book called Delegated Authority. Within the four governments, self, family, church, and civil, God has given positions of authority. Of course, one, it's self-government, is you. You're to govern your life according to his rule. But in family, it's mother and father. In churches, it's pastors, elders. In civil government, it's from the policeman all the way up to the president, right? The authority that anyone possesses in one of these governments is delegated authority. In other words, it's authority given to them from God. Therefore, they have a duty to govern according to his rule. Very important. That's what she's referring to when she says, God, from whom their power ultimately was derived, had limited that power. Okay, now this is important to understand. The authority they possess is limited. The civil authorities, the authority they possess is limited authority. That's what she's referring to. I know we live in a statist hell where we think the state can do anything, including telling us to put masks on our faces and put bad stuff inside our bodies. I heard one churchman say, if the governor tells us to put pinwheels on our heads to go into the store, we put pinwheels on our heads to. No, we don't. You are the state. Okay? So like the Hebrew midwives were told to do something bad, they didn't obey. Daniel wasn't told to do something bad, he was told he couldn't do something good. Prayed to the Lord, he prayed anyway. And they command you to do that which is against God, or forbid you to do that which is of God. We have a duty to obey God rather than man. So that's one instance in where resistance must be offered. The other is when the civil authorities exceed the limits of their authority. Whether biblically, because God limits it in his word, what their authority is, or constitutionally, since we live in America. They go outside those two things, then they are to be resisted. They are to be opposed. Blithe submission is not spiritual, and often it is sin. So this is important to understand. Here's a quote from John of Salisbury. How many of you have ever read Polycraticus? Good. I've only met one guy who's actually read it all. He was in the military 20 years ago, and his regiment commander had everybody in there read it. It was written in 1159 AD. It wasn't political theory, it was political reality for the time. All of my children have to read Polycraticus when they're about 13, 14 years old. Some are a little smarter than others, so you pick out which one's good for their age. He said this regarding the civil lesser authorities. He said, loyal shoulders should sustain the power of the ruler so long as it is exercised in subjection to God and follows his ordinances. But if it resists and opposes the divine commandments and wishes to make me share in its war against God, then with unrestrained voice I answer back that God must be preferred before any man on earth. This is what Western men understood up until just a short time ago when the state took over. When you study the history of mankind, atheistic societies produce statist societies. And we're in the midst of a statist society because so many are in rebellion against the Lord at this time. I'm going to skip you know why? Because if the lesser authorities don't stop the evil that the superior authority does, then the evil gets down in the fabric of society. And trying to uproot it is nearly impossible. The preborn have suffered the worst oppression in our country for the last 50 years, precisely because of what I just said to you. When Obergefell came down, the ruling that said 2 men and 2 women can marry, when that came down, we were working with the officials in Tennessee. They were a hair's breadth from defying the federal judiciary, which I'm going to be getting to in a little bit here. We were a hair's breadth from them defying the federal judiciary. The largest pro-family group in the state talked them out of it. And when there was the public hearing for their bill of interposition, that guy went up there and said everything that the homosexuals had gathered, that they didn't even go up after, and you watched them nodding their heads. They knew he had already done the work for them. And guess what? He said we should go to the courts. And they bought it. And a year and a half later, his case was dead, and Obergefell was still the opinion on that. So after a year and a half, during the next session, we tried to get the legislature to do the same thing again and just openly defy the federal judiciary. The first time around, we had 49 legislators on board, signed onto the bill. We couldn't even get 10 2 years later. You know why? Because the evil had sifted down in the fabric of society. Interposition is massively important. And the interposition of the lesser magistrates, you have to understand, is massively important also because the tyrant superior authority counts on the blithe compliance of the lesser authorities in order to get their evil down into the fabric of society. And it's when they don't have that compliance that they know they have a problem on their hands. This is very important to understand. You know, it's your governors that are in your state. It's your governors that allow. The Supreme Court has no policing powers whatsoever, but the governors go along with all this. And then they hide behind the skirt of the court and say, yeah, I'm opposed to the murder of the preborn. I'm opposed to homosexual marriage. But the Supreme Court has ruled all we can do is obey. And that's a lie. And you have to remove that lie from them. And I hope to show you that in a few minutes here, how you do that. The doctrine can need application in any because of the nature of man. He's wicked and in need of a savior. Man can, people often ask me, they say, what's the best form of government, Pastor Mann? I said, well, there's really not a best form. There's forms that are better than others, but not a best form. But I will tell you this, is that man can corrupt any form of government. Whether it's a dictatorship, a democracy, or a representative constitutional was to be, they can corrupt it for arresting the progress of evil and for maintaining within their perspective limits the authorities' rights and liberties appertaining to them, appertaining to the states. Madison had said before the Constitution was ratified that the powers given to the federal government are few and defined. The powers that remain at the states are many. Plethora. Read the 10th Amendment. So, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution. It's also a gem, and he said in part that whensoever the general government, talking about the federal government, assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Okay? So it didn't take long. I show you this so you understand. Our founders expected the lesser authorities to intervene when the superior authorities did evil. That's what they expected. They didn't expect blithe compliance. In fact, in the state I'm from, Wisconsin, there was a runaway slave in the year 1854 named Joshua Glover. He had been living in Kenosha, which is about an hour south of where I live in Wisconsin, and living as a carpenter. He was a great carpenter. Federal marshals came with his owner, and they arrested him, beat him badly, brought him up to Milwaukee, and put him in the county jail. Well, there was a newspaper man, this guy, Sherman Booth, who rode up a handbill and rode his horse up and down the streets like Paul Revere of old, yelling at the top of his lungs, "A man's liberty is at stake. Gather at the courthouse at 2 p.m. And over 5,000 people showed up. Booth even said later how stunned he was how many came. If you know how people were back then, they broke up into committees. Some were writing resolutions. Another wrote a habeas corpus to get Joshua the slave released. That was denied. It's about 5 o'clock now. Everybody's getting ready to leave. And here comes the sheriff from Racine. I said Kenosha. I meant Racine. He was in Racine living as a carpenter. The sheriff shows up with 120 men by boat, get off, and they start marching towards the jail. So people start gathering back in like something's going to happen here. And there was about 30 men who had had enough. And there was a church being built across the street, and they took a massive beam and they smashed down the jail door, and they brought Joshua Glover out. They set him on the back of a flatbed wagon. He looked over the crowd with a sea of faces, and he said 2 words, "Glory, hallelujah." And they put him on the Underground Railroad. He made it to Canada, out of America and to Canada 2 weeks later, and died of old age 26 years later. Well, the federal government was mad because the slave got away. So they wanted their pound of flesh, so they went after Sherman Booth. And this became a battle of jurisdictions between the state of Wisconsin and the federal government that went on all the way up to the Civil War. It never was resolved. It became moot because of the Civil War. But our state Supreme Court and our state legislature defied the U.S. Supreme Court and defied the entire federal government over the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. And there's a million awesome stories I can tell you about all that, but we don't have time. They also went on to say this, resolved that the government formed by the Constitution of the United States was not the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, but that as in all other cases of compact, and that's what the Constitution is, a compact, among parties having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself. See, a lot of people think, oh, there's got to be this final arbiter, right? And they think SCOTUS is the final arbiter. They are not. Our founders never wanted a final arbiter. They wanted this tension between the different branches of government precisely because they had a biblical view of the nature of man, that he was wicked and in need of a Savior named Jesus Christ. So this is how history was. This is how things were in reality. Necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves. And didn't we see that massively when it came to the whole COVID thing, to bring things up to our day now? So, I want to talk to you about Madison County, Illinois, just briefly. We documented over 500 acts of interposition by the federal government. Okay? And understand, there's been an awesome awakening going on. Whether it'll sustain itself or not, who knows? Usually when pressure releases, people go home, and I've already told you, the tyrants aren't going away. You cannot appease tyrants, you have to defeat them. They are laying low. It's an election year. They are not done. So you may recall, what I've seen is most people have been realizing not only is Washington, D.C. at war with them, they've learned over the last 2 years their state authorities aren't going to protect them. And so they've been flooding in from coast to coast into county and local government to make a stand for freedom. That's what, and this is a goodness. I've told people for years, get off that hamster wheel they got you on, just mesmerized by the presidential election. It's idiocy. Have you ever read the Constitution, how much authority the president's actually supposed to have? Okay, you might want to do that. And they've stampeded everybody to vote for their guy based on who puts the Supreme Court justices in. Okay? I could never get people to stop doing that. Now it's happening. They've gone into local and county government in order to make a stand for freedom. Understand there's over 3,100 counties in America. And about 500 of them saw acts of interposition by county and local officials. I want to just share this story with you. It's about Madison County. Remember back in May of 2020 when these governors were coming out with new draconian edicts like every 72 hours? Well, Governor Pritzker, who's just south of our state, he's the governor of Illinois, on May 20th, 2020, came out with his latest little draconian edict, and it was this. If any businessman opens their business before I say you can open your business, you will now be arrested and charged with a crime. And the very next day, in a state with 102 counties, only one county assembled their board, and they published their own edict. Madison County, which is on the Mississippi River, directly across from St. Louis. And their edict declared that their businessmen are free to reopen now, and that they would use all their authority and all their power to protect their businessmen, and then they cautioned the governor and the state not to interfere with their businessmen. Well, Governor Pritzker responded in good tyrant fashion And the next day he held a press conference, damning Madison County, saying he was going to remove their federal money, their state money, and he had a list of bad things he was going to do to them. In fact, he did that for the next 3 days. But the men of Madison County held resolute, firm, they didn't waver, and this was all in the news. And finally, on the 7th day after he initially gave his decree, the Illinois State Police put out a press release stating that they would not arrest any businessman anywhere in the state who opened their business before Governor Pritzker said that. They had decided to stand with Madison County. And the very next day after that, Governor Pritzker rescinded his order. That's how the doctrine of the lesser magistrates is meant to work. So understand, if it had not been for the interposition of that one county, the entire state would have remained under the draconian decree of Governor Pritzker. And by the way, the guy who heads up Madison County is a Christian brother. He's still in office today. And he had read my book on the doctrine of the lesser magistrate 2 years earlier and had taught it to the men on the county board. They know exactly what they're doing. Praise the Lord. This is another county, Missouri County, Newton County down in southern Missouri. They did right, they've read my book, these are good men. Remember about a year ago, in February of 2021, Joe Biden was threatening everybody's Second Amendment rights and how he was going to pass laws or executive orders in order to infringe on our rights? The county board of Newton County, Missouri gathered together and they actually wrote an ordinance in defiance of Biden's lawlessness of federal intrusion on their people in their jurisdiction. And their ordinance declares three things. Number one, it declares that any law or policy which infringes upon the Second Amendment rights of their citizens is null, void, and of no authority in their county. Secondly, it states that any county official who aids and abets any federal or state agents who try to infringe on the Second Amendment rights of their citizens shall be removed from office. And third, it instructs their sheriff to arrest any federal or state agents who come into their county trying to infringe upon the Second Amendment rights of their citizens. Amen. That's the interposition of the lesser magistrates in action. And so the media attacked these guys really bad. It was awful. But often what they mean for evil, the Lord uses for good. And so word spread about what they did, and several more counties across the state passed the same ordinance in their counties. So it was encouraging to see. Now let me get to this matter of judicial supremacy, because this is huge. The magistrates, as I mentioned earlier, love to hide behind the skirt of the court and say, I agree with you on that, I'm against this, or I'm for this, but the courts have ruled, all we can do is obey. It is a lie. And I want to show you it's a lie. And the lie is called judicial supremacy. So here's what the judicial supremacists say. They say, first off, when SCOTUS issues an opinion, that opinion is the law of the land. Ever heard that before? Okay. It's not true. It isn't the law of the land. Article 1, Section 1 of our U.S. Constitution declares that all lawmaking power resides in Congress, which consists of a House and a Senate. Now, I would get A's in every subject while I was growing up, but when it came to math, I'd get D's. And when they brought letters into math, I was completely confused. But even I understand if all lawmaking power resides with Congress, how much lawmaking power does that leave to the judiciary? That's right, zero. None. And that's why Justice Scalia in the Obergefell ruling came down in 2015 that 2 men or 2 women can marry. He said Obergefell is a naked judicial claim to legislative, indeed super-legislative power, a claim fundamentally at odds with our system of government. In fact, if you read his dissenting opinion, they're usually very ironic. He pushed the ironic mode to the extreme. Another thing to note is that there were 83 legal scholars, many of them teaching at major public universities, in October of 2015 who issued an edict calling upon the other branches of the federal government and upon the state authorities to defy the judiciary. And they stated, carte blanche, the opinions of the court are not the law of the land, because they're not. It's a fiction built by lawyers. And unfortunately, it's a fiction that's bolstered by everything you see on the news, by what you're taught in the school system, even what you're taught by the pro-life, pro-family groups. They all tell you we have to undo Roe. I'm here to tell you we don't have to undo Roe. And I want to show you that this matter of judicial supremacy is a lie. The second part of their fiction is SCOTUS is the final arbiter of what is constitutional and what is unconstitutional. Ever heard that? Everybody has. That's what they say. The truth of the matter is, when they say that, they point you to Article 6, Paragraph 2. And they say, that's the supremacy clause. That gives the U.S. Supreme Court and the federal judiciary the supremacy over the Constitution. Okay, well, if you actually go to Article 6, Paragraph 2, you'll notice that the Supreme Court isn't even mentioned. You'll notice that the federal judiciary isn't even mentioned, and you'll notice what actually has the supremacy is the Constitution itself. They've built a lie around this idea that they can totally reinterpret the Constitution into what they want it to say. This is bad. In fact, 2 paragraphs later, in paragraph 4, you know what the U.S. Constitution talks about? It talks about how every magistrate, whether in state government or federal government, takes an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution. They don't take an oath to uphold federal power. They don't take an oath to uphold lawless and immoral court opinions issued by SCOTUS. They take an oath to uphold the Constitution. So when I meet with magistrates, I point this out to them, and I say to them, show me in the Constitution where a preborn child can be murdered by their own mother and father. And they go, it's not there. And it isn't. Even the Supreme Court said it's penumbras, emanations. They made it up out of thin air. And then I said, I look at them and I say, and what did you take an oath to uphold? And I don't say this. You need to know when to be quiet. Just let it sink in. Once you overcome this matter of judicial supremacy in their minds, where they see it is a fiction, and it's easily done, I've done it with countless magistrates, then you're up against the worst problem, which is cowardice, a lack of courage. And that's a much harder nut to crack in order to get these lesser authorities to do their duty. Thomas Jefferson said to a judicial supremacist of his day, you seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions, a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. They've long been there. Long been there. Thomas Jefferson spent the last 23 years of his life at war with the federal judiciary because he saw exactly what they were doing. They were taking their opinions and they were writing powers to themselves and to the federal government not granted to them in the Constitution. In fact, it only took 6 years for the Supreme Court, not 11 like the legislature and the federal government, 6 years for the judiciary to issue an opinion bringing authority to themselves, not granted to them, and to the federal government, not granted in the Constitution. And our legislature at that time passed what's now known as the 11th Amendment in order to counter what the judiciary did. But 24 years later, the judiciary did the same thing regarding the 11th Amendment, and it stood after that because men went along with it. There was a huge war that went on and has gone on over the years. Most people are drunk on wealth and ease and they don't care about these things. Tyranny has reached a point where it must be responded to, and people are realizing they no longer have the convenience of being indifferent towards the unjust and immoral actions of their government, that they must engage. And so they are. Jefferson said this, the Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. Knowing that to whatever hands confided with the corruptions of time and party, its members will become despots. That's exactly what, there is no final arbiter. The Constitution was written so anybody could understand it. You don't need experts called lawyers to decipher it for you. You can read the minutes of the Continental Congress, of the Convention, and see exactly what they intended regarding the judiciary. And that's delineated in Article 3 of the Constitution. There was to be no single tribunal. James Madison, who's the architect of the U.S. Constitution, said on the subject of an arbiter or umpire, there can be none external to the U.S. federal government more than the individual states. They expected the states to defy. They expected them to interpose when evil was being done, not to blindly comply. What they've done with the states, the federal beast has been smart. They've reduced the states to mere provinces of the federal government, to mere implementation centers of unjust and immoral law, policy, and court opinion. And they've been smart about it. They've bought off the allegiance of the state officials with the purse. The third part of the fiction is all other authorities in the nation must bow down to whatever SCOTUS issues. This was all said by the Supreme Court by itself in its 1958 opinion on the Arab case. They said these things themselves. So, it's not true. All the other branches aren't to bow down. Our founders didn't expect there to be any final arbiter, but the magistrates have found it a useful means to act like they're for or against something while they hide behind the court, the skirt of the court. Alexander Hamilton, I want you to see these quotes. Of them. Our founders viewed the judiciary as the weakest of the three branches. Alexander Hamilton, who had the biggest love affair with the judiciary, said the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution because it will be least in the capacity to annoy or injure them. The judiciary met down in the basement. James Madison, the architect, said the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. He said in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. Thomas Jefferson said at the establishment of our constitutions, the judiciary bodies were supposed to be the most helpless and harmless members of the government. All these terms are being used. You understand that's all been turned on its head now. And now all the other branches of government, whatever level, all bows down to SCOTUS. It is never what our founders intended. And listen to the arrogance of the Supreme Court justices in the cells. This is Justice Charles Evan Hughes. Understand this is 1907. This thing's been around a long time. He said, we are under a constitution, but the constitution... Oftentimes we see legislatures passing good laws only to be, quote unquote, undone by the judiciary. The Constitution nowhere has a suicide pact with the judiciary labeled in there. Okay? Listen to Harlan Stone. He was appointed by a Republican president and then made Chief Justice by a Democrat president. He said, the only check upon our own exercise of power is our own self-restraint. Is that crazy? This is the arrogance, the hubris of the court. Here's what Justice Richard Posner, he is retired now, he retired in 2017. He was placed on the federal court in 2004 by, 1984, if I remember right, by Ronald Reagan himself. He said this at a speech he gave not too long ago. He said, it's funny to talk about the oath judges take to uphold the Constitution since the Supreme Court has transformed the Constitution in its decisions. The oath is not really to the original Constitution or to the Constitution as amended. It is to some body of law created by the Supreme Court. You can forget about the oath. That is not of significance. He wasn't saying that to chide people who believe that. He was stating he believes that. And when you look at his rulings while he was on the federal bench, he upheld homosexual marriage. He attacked our state constitution, he was in the Senate. appellate district. He attacked our state constitution regarding marriage between a man and a woman. He trampled laws that were passed on behalf of the preborn because they're lawless, because we removed the objective standard, which is the law of God. They feel they have no restraint. Alpheus Thomas Mason, he's alive, he wrote this: in government, the framers designed as the basic premise that unchecked power in any hands whatsoever is intolerable. Our founders never would have went along with this. Never. Thomas Jefferson said this. He said, the germ of dissolution of our federal government is in the Constitution of the Federal Judiciary. An irresponsible body for impeachment is scarcely a scarecrow. Anybody ever wants you to try to start impeaching federal judges, don't waste your time. There's plenty to replace them who think just like them. Working like gravity by night and by day, gaining a little today and a little tomorrow, and advancing its noiseless step like a thief over the field of jurisdiction until all shall be usurped. We've long been there in America, over 100 years, where everyone bows down to the federal judiciary and does whatever's going on. Have you ever been to Washington, D.C. when they're coming out with one of their opinions? I have. There's thousands of people, or at least hundreds of people, waiting to see what comes out. There's always hundreds of media people, and they're all waiting for the oracle to speak, to tell them how to think, to tell them how to behave. Our founders would be appalled. They would be stunned that Americans have been reduced to that. It's so evil what has gone on here. And the only ones who can break this cabal are the people themselves. You must demand of your magistrates to do their duty and interpose when evil is done. That is the role of the people regarding the doctrine, lesser magistrate. You prod your authorities to do right. You demand they do right. Don't let them put their arms around you and tell you how hard it is here and blah, blah, blah. That's garbage. They're in the office. Wield your office properly, sir. Do right in the sight of God. Do your duty and interpose against the evil. That's what you have to say. You also have to assure them that if they do right, that you'll stand with them foursquare, with your person, with your property, with your prayers, both publicly and privately. You have to rally around your lesser authorities. Demand they do right and assure them you'll stand with them if they do right. Here's what's gone on with the pro-life movement, which I've been involved in. I did about 16 months in jail for interposing on behalf of the preborn. I've been involved in that battle. When we started in 1988 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, there were 8 abortion clinics in our city. Thanks be to God, there's only 2 left now, and abortion has dropped by 69% in our state, whereas the national average during that same time has been about 17 or 18%. So I was part of the whole process of always trying to do exactly what this is making fun of. So, I mean, notice there's only a gate there. You can go around, and abolish abortion without going through Rome. But they all want you to think you have to go through Rome. In fact, Roe has been before the court 38 times. I'm talking about the Supreme Court. That isn't counting the hundreds of cases that were killed by federal courts lower than the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court itself has revisited abortion 38 times since this all started. And they've upheld it every single time. Yet we do the same thing. It's like Lucy with Charlie Brown. Kick the football, Charlie Brown. I really mean it this time. And what have the Republicans done? They've stampeded us every 4 years to vote for their president, because then we get to appoint the Supreme Court justices and Roe v. Wade will be overturned. Let me tell you, 6 of the 9 justices that were on the bench when Roe v. Wade was decided were Republican appointed. And for the next 34 and a half years after that, mark that, 34 and a half years, with many changes made on the court, often with the Republican president making the change, the Republican-appointed justices outnumbered the Democrat-appointed ones either 7-2 or 8-1. for 34 and a half years. And yet abortion is still legal in America. Because the Republican authorities have found it useful to stampede a good portion of people to always vote for their guys, to always vote for their president. It is wrong. It's one thing to be ignorant of that kind of thing, but when you know it, you have a duty to see that it ends. You have to hold them accountable. I don't vote for any Republican who isn't going to promise that they will interpose on behalf of the murdered preborn. None. I've been at war with these guys for the last 2 years over the COVID thing. They have aided and abetted the evil. They have funded it, and they have passed laws to aid and abet it. We just had another law passed a few weeks ago where they actually increased the powers of our health officials in Wisconsin, and we have an overwhelmingly Republican legislature, rather than protect the families and the individuals who've been harmed by these health Nazis, who should have never had the power they've had to begin with. Understand, you must stand against the evil at a personal level, and you must stand against it at a public level. At a personal level, this is what it looks like. So I haven't been able to fly in a plane for 2 years. Why? Because I know I'll end up in a federal prison because I can't abide their stupidity and make me put a mask on. Will not do it. Haven't worn a mask since this whole thing started. Some people say to me, well, it's just a mask, Pastor Matt. And I say, no, it's not just a mask. It's tied to a very evil narrative. You have to understand tyranny is built plank by plank. Understand when the Jews, and they're well known, the history of what happened to them during World War II, the Jews weren't just called down to the railroad station one day and told to jump in the boxcars. It all started 8 years later with a law that said they couldn't sit on a public bench. And the Jews thought, well, it's just a public bench. It's just a mask. And they accommodated themselves to it. And then there was another law passed. And then another one. And then another one. And then 8 years later, the final solution was there. Get on the boxcars. You have to resist and oppose tyranny at a personal level when it raises its ugly head. The longer you allow them to put each plank of their tyranny in place, the harder it is to undo their tyranny. Right now, everybody's thinking, well, things are better. We're all back at the bars, and man, we're hanging out like Woodstocks and all this kind of stuff. They're building the whole infrastructure. Republicans and Democrats together. 27 states already have put the apparatus in place for vaccine passports. Like, nobody knows that, but it's true. And you can learn it easy enough. Even Forbes magazine has been writing about it. So understand, they're building the evil while everyone's thinking everything's good now. They're continuing to build the evil. They say, well, it's all voluntary. It's all voluntary. Yeah, it's all voluntary till it's not voluntary. And then you're forced to do it. Understand, they're using the businessmen in order to get their evil accomplished. I keep telling people this. A lot of people have this view that a business can do whatever it wants, and they tell you to put a mask on, or you want to work for them, you have to have a shot and put a bunch of experimental stuff in your arm. They have a right to do that because they're a private business. There are no private businesses in America. Have you ever looked at American corporate law? There is, it would take this whole room filled with bookshelves to cover just the books dealing with corporate law in America. You are brought under so much regulation, bureaucracy, and policy and law whenever you open a business. And not only that, but every business in America just about has their elbow deep in tax money. They all got their arms in the tax money, driving that tax. The magistrates have a duty to protect us not only from the government itself, but from the businessmen, from the corporations too. And you must demand that they do it. What did Joe Biden do back in August when he announced his 100-employee mandate? Remember that? You have 100 employees or more, you're going to have to all get the shot. It's going to be mandated. He knew he was probably going to lose that in the courts. He spent the next 10 days after he made that announcement meeting with the biggest corporate leaders in America in order to get them on board, to get done through the quote-unquote private sector what they knew they wouldn't get accomplished through the public sector. And when you read any story about these vaccine passports that are being built, they're called, this is why it stinks getting old, right? What are they called? No, GMOs or, not GMOs. What's that? Nope. Anyway, it's where you use a non-government entity in order to get something governmental accomplished. NGOs, thank you. Okay, yeah. So anyway, I am 61. So they're using this. You have to understand, men fought, bled, and died for the freedoms we have. And they shouldn't be able to be taken away by corporations or by the government. This is extremely important stuff. When it comes to the murder of the preborn, here's a quote from William Blackstone about murder. Remember, he's the most cited legal scholar by America's founders. He said, to instance in the case of murder, this is in his commentaries, this is expressly forbidden by the divine and demonstrably by the natural law, and from these prohibitions arises the true unlawfulness of this crime. Those human laws that annex a punishment to do it do not at all increase its moral guilt or superadd any fresh obligation in foro consciente, in the court of conscience, to abstain from its perpetration. So what he's saying is, divine law and natural law, which natural law affirms divine law, and the law about it. That's what he's simply saying. And then he goes on and he says this. And of course we know he believes they should make laws against murder. He said, nay, if any human law should allow or enjoin us to commit murder, we are bound to transgress that human law, or else we must offend both the natural and the divine. Okay? So this is the thinking of Western man for over 1,500 years regarding these matters. When it comes to murder, the magistrate should have immediately in 1973 stopped it. And that was the biggest motivator for me to write the book on the doctrine of lesser magistrate, is the fact that we're talking about murder when it comes to abortion. Grisly, brutal murder. And there wasn't one governor, one legislature, one mayor, one city council that simply said no. No one will be murdered here. We got our work cut out for us when it comes to this judicial supremacy thing. Jefferson said this in the Kentucky Resolutions. He said, if those who administer the general government be permitted to transgress the limits fixed by the compact, by a total disregard of the special delegations of power therein contained, annihilation of the state governments and the erection upon their ruins of a general consolidation government will be the inevitable consequence. Jefferson was prescient on these things. He foresaw what was going to happen. We've long been there, what he's describing. James Iredell said this. He was the only dissenting Supreme Court justice in that court opinion, Georgia versus whoever it was, 6 years after they tried in the Constitution. And he said this, every state in the Union, in every instance where its sovereignty has not been delegated to the United States, I consider to be as completely sovereign as the United States are in respect to the powers surrendered. The United States are sovereign as to all the powers of government actually surrendered to them by the states. Each state in the Union is sovereign as to all the powers reserved. It must necessarily be so because the United States have no claim to any authority but such as the states have surrendered to them. They've long been out of the constraints the Constitution put them under. I laugh when I hear civil authorities talk about the Constitution. They could care less about the Constitution, but we should. I talked about true federalism, talked about the oath. Frederick Douglass said this, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. You have to demand that they do right. James Madison said, The powers delegated by the proposed constitution of the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. That's all been turned on its head. Because our state authorities have allowed it. Our governors and our legislatures have allowed it because we, the people, have allowed them to get away with that. James Madison said this, and I'll close with this. He said, the preservation of a free government requires not merely that the metes and bounds which separate each department of power may be invariably maintained, but more especially that neither of them be suffered to overleap the great barrier which defends the rights of the people. The rulers who are guilty of such an encroachment exceed, remember, go outside their limits of authority, exceed the commission from which they derive their authority and are tyrants. The people who submit to it are governed by laws made neither by themselves nor by any authority derived from them and are slaves. And that's where we're at. So it's extremely important for us to act. To talk about the things that our founders gave us. And to not allow them to just roll over the top of us. So I think I'm right about where I was at, because I think Paul wanted us done at 8 o'clock. And he was hoping for about 10 minutes if anybody wanted Q&A. I don't know if you wanted to do that still, or... Anyway, that's our website, defytyrants.com. There's a million other things I could say, but yeah. I'm sure some of you are like, don't worry. We'll just take a couple questions. I know everybody's got church tomorrow. Yes?
Okay, so I'm not a Biden supporter, like I'm sure you're not.
I'm not a Biden supporter.
I'm not a Biden supporter. I don't agree with what he is doing, but some good has come from what he has done. And that is people are starting to realize what's happening in the schools, what's happening in their community, and they're starting to put into place some of what you are talking about.
Yes.
So good is coming from some of that.
Yes.
Bad.
I always tell people that God's judgment on a nation is a goodness to man. It's really a mercy to us, because the debauchery and degradation of mankind knows no bottom. I've lived 61 years now. When I think they can't come up with anything worse, they come up with something worse. Something you couldn't even imagine in your mind until you watch it go down. But in the midst of that, you see God doing a good thing. I believe the form of Christianity that we've had in this country and in the West for decades now is an awful form of Christianity. It's incapable of reforming itself. So the Lord has unleashed the tyrants upon the land. Because if we won't repent and bring reformation ourselves, He'll use the tyrants to see that the job gets done.
That's right.
He uses His judgment as a goodness. So thank you for pointing that out. And another thing that I've seen that's good is, in the midst of all that's going on, I've seen Christians not only begin to involve themselves in civil government matters, but I've also seen them begin to build stronger homes, stronger congregations, even medical structures, realizing that the medical industry is crazy and are out of hand. And so there's many doctors and nurses who still want to practice their calling, who are doing things along in conjunction with our own congregation. Has done a lot of work in this regard for cash-based clinics in our area. So it's good to see that Christian men understand they must engage on a very practical level as evil continues to unfold. And the evil's going to continue to unfold as the days go by. There's been repentance. I've seen it. People deep in their walk with the Lord. I've even seen people won to Christ who were alarmed by what they see and gave ear to God's word and gospel because of it. But there hasn't been a run on sackcloth and ashes down at the Ace Hardware. There's a lot more judgment that needs to come. The vast majority are still indifferent. So The form of Christianity we have, I talked about this before. If you go to our website, defytyrants.com, we have 4 things right on the home page that change. One of them changes and says, why aren't pastors involved? And I have 3 short articles there, a 45-minute lecture, and a 2.5-minute video also, where I explain it's the form of Christianity that we've developed. That's why pastors aren't involved. Understand God's word speaks to all matters of life, including the matters of civil government. But we've pillared a Christianity that thinks it's spiritual to have nothing to do with civil government matters. And because Christianity has by and large abandoned that realm, wicked men have filled the void and they've made their worldview law, policy, and court opinion, to the hurt of the nation. And so these churchmen have also pillared many slogans to make you feel bad if you get involved in civil government matters. Slogans like, if you bring something up about a civil government matter like this, oh, we should just preach the gospel. Or, oh, we should just pray. Or, I just expect sinners to act like sinners. Or, God's got this. He's in control. They actually invoke something as awesome as the sovereignty of God to justify their indifference in inaction towards the evil that's being done. Let me tell you, the whole history of Christianity has been to confront the idols and evils and tyrants of the day. You see it in the book of Acts all the way through church history. What they've pillared here over the last 250 years is an aberration of true Christianity. So you have to be able to dismantle those little slogans that they come up with. So let's take the number 1 slogan. I'll only do this one. We should just preach the gospel. I've had I'm a churchman, I'm a pastor. Churchmen tell me that for over 3 decades. We should just preach the gospel. I say we have to do something for the preborn. They're being butchered. We should just preach the gospel. First off, nobody just preaches the gospel.
That's right.
Do you ever take your kids for a walk, spend time with your wife, use the restroom? Nobody just preaches the gospel, number 1. Number 2, notice when they say we should just preach the gospel. Just listen. Next time you're at church and the church potluck's announced, see if anyone jumps up and says, oh no, we should just preach the gospel. Or when the next church softball team's being organized, see if anyone leaves and says, oh no, we should just preach the gospel. It's only when you bring up some civil government matter that they say it. It's meant to neutralize you. It's actually meant to shame you, to make you feel unspiritual, put a wet blanket over you to get you back on the religious hamster wheel. That's what it's designed to do. And then the third thing I always say, where are all these people just preaching the gospel? Because I never run into them. I'm like a literature dropping windmill through my day. I leave literature everywhere I go. I hand it to people. I talk to people. I never even see tracts laying around. I never have anyone come up to me to talk to me about Christ, ever. Where are all these people there? You have to dismantle these little slogans and show them for the fraud that they are. Okay? It's extremely important. But anyways, thank you for bringing that up. I went way too long in good pastoral fashion.
I've been seeing a bunch of the hands get up, so we'll try to get through as many as we can here, as long as everyone stays awake.
This is a 2-part question.
Sure.
It's probably going to take a minute.
Okay.
I want to say, first, I think that a good thing that came out of this whole thing with COVID and the mask and the schools and all of that is I saw a lot more, the majority of the people that stood up were Christian women. And I thought that was refreshing, but on the same hand, I guess, it was a little discouraging to see how many Christian men did not stand up.
Yes.
Did not see that in any large-scale capacity. And what I want to ask you is, 70% of Americans identify as Christian. Yet we're inundated with a narrative that tells us that America is okay with sodomy. We're okay with the transgender movement. We're okay with all of these things that are basically Sodom and Gomorrah. And it is a perception. And then you got people like me and Pastor Paul and probably 80 to 90% of the guys in this building who do not believe that. And we're talking about interposition. How do you do that and it not come to blood when the perception that's being pushed is one thing, and the reality on the ground is another? Or do you believe that the narrative on the ground, if that perception is accurate, do you believe that? How do we not come to blood if that's so?
Sure. Well, the goodness of this doctrine, well, first let me address your first part about the Christian women and the Christian men. It was an awful thing to watch, that the men stayed home. I've watched this for decades now. I've testified at many school board meetings over the years where they've brought evil in. Often I'm asked to come to counties I don't even live in, school districts I'm not a part of. We homeschool our own children because they can't find one minister in the district that'll speak, not one. And then you see the parents that show up at some of these meetings and support the evil that's being done. And you're thinking, they don't even have natural affection for their children, for their sons and daughters anymore. It's really grievous. It'll make you weep. It's made me weep. Where I've left those places and I weep. Understand, when it comes to the men, there's been a war against men in this culture by law, policy, and court opinion for decades. A simple example is abortion. Man has absolutely no say whether his son or daughter lives or dies. I've been there when a young man actually blocked the door to keep his own child from being butchered. He's arrested, taken to jail, and the killing went forward. If you've ever ended up in divorce court, I haven't, but I've talked with a million men who have, you have no idea how awful that is. That's why many men after a divorce spend the rest of their life at a bar, just trying to drink away their woes. It is feminist rot made public policy. And it's so bad that many feminists over the last 10 years have been writing about the war on men and its ill effects upon society. Even many feminists. Well, I shouldn't say many, but some. So this whole egalitarian world that they've created, where we don't want distinctions between males and females, has led to the acceptance of homosex, has led to the acceptance of transgenderism now, and is in the process of leading to transhumanism. I hope you don't freak out about that, but just look it up. This whole COVID thing, part of their involvement is transhumanism. I used to say the greatest act of rebellion against the Lord was to be involved in homosexuality. You're taking your very created being, your gender, and spitting in his face. Now they're actually after the image of God in man itself. They want to actually transform us from being other than what the Creator made us to be. And if you think that's crazy, because I don't go with crazy stuff, I investigate everything. And it's like, if you look into that, you will be chilled where they want to take all this too. Secondly, when it comes to the matter of, what was your second thing? Oh, coming to blows. That's the goodness of the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. It provides an opportunity to rein in the tyranny of the superior authority bloodlessly. But it doesn't always work. And if it doesn't work, we will end up there. Just read history. Men will either have bloody revolution or they'll go into 80 years of Soviet-style enslavement. And the technology they've created now is a tyrant's paradise. The surveillance they're able to create over our lives, every inch of our lives, is astounding. So either men will stand up, and we're Christian men. We understand that we don't go to blows needlessly. We have pillared plenty of Christian thought, both from the early church fathers and from the reformers, making it clear, showing from Scripture, our duty as men to go to arms if needs be, if it gets to that point. So it could come to that point. One of the things that we have going for us is we have an armed citizenry. Or else we would probably be like Australia, New Zealand, Canada. I have friends in all those countries. You can't believe the oppression that they're under. Scotland, France, it's crazy. My concern is most men aren't men any longer. And I always laugh when guys tell me, when they come down my driveway, they're going to be sorry because they got all these guns, right? And I tell them, when they come down your driveway, you're on a suicide mission because you aren't getting out of there alive. It's much better to coalesce with men beforehand and meet the enemy down the road than it is in your driveway where your sons and your daughters and your wife are all in peril. So it's important to understand that good Christian men, before the founding of this nation, trained in the use of arms and tactics to be prepared if they needed to do things. And I think that's a no-brainer for churchmen across, for Christian men and men in general across this nation. And I've seen a real goodness in all that, because there are men gathering and doing those things. And I've seen unbelievers become a part of this where they are converted to Christ in the process of it all. But anyways, all those things are in God's hands. The most important thing is that we live faithful and true to Him. Because we don't know what's going to happen in the days ahead and the plans that they have. But it's important that we remain faithful and true to Him in the midst of it all. And it may be death, a martyr's death, maybe something different. I could share stories about that too. God has different things for different people. Yes?
All right, I think we're going to take one more question here, and then after that, Matt will be out in his booth there, and so feel free, if you have another pressing question, you can try to catch him at the booth or send him an email. I just want to make sure we respect our time with everybody here tonight. So one more question here.
This is crazy. I have read your book, and I really appreciated it. And one thing that stood out too is how I just can't really trust judicial so much in the legal part. And so right after I had read that book, my husband and I were looking over our will and updating it, and I read it a whole lot more carefully than I normally would. But it's like, I'm almost afraid to sign that, and I'm not, it's like, it's basically the state owns you now.
Wow.
And I mean, it's complicated. And so, do you have any comment on that?
About wills?
Yeah.
Read it over carefully. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
How do you know when you
And the fact, even in that area, they've invaded the marital union, right? You think your wife should be able to tell them what they should do for your medical care because you know each other intimately. No, if you don't have a will, giving them power of attorney, even though they're your spouse, they have no say over your medical care. And if you sign the document giving power of attorney to your spouse, it costs nothing. But if you wait till your spouse is incapacitated, it's going to cost you $3,000 with a lawyer to sign that same piece of paper and have power of attorney. But yeah, we live in a statist house. They've invaded family government, including that area of the sacredness of the marital union regarding medical matters. It's very wicked. One last thing I wanted to say, because I didn't say it properly when I was addressing you, and you have to be careful when you talk about those things, because people like to misconstrue on this. As Christian men, we're not violent men. But we understand there's times when arms must be used to defend what's right, to defend our homes, maybe to defend our county, our state, whatever. Extremely important for Christian men to understand. And as I said, Christian men wrote about all these things many times before us. And they have really good thoughts about it. And I encourage you to become readers and read about those things too that Christian men have written about regarding that matter.
I asked the question because I am a reader.
Well, you are what?
I am a reader.
Oh, awesome. Great. Yeah. Praise God. Here's one of the things that I run into, right? Most people aren't in America. They don't read. So I asked them, I said, you like to read? Almost all of them say no, especially the men. No, I'm not a good reader. And I said, well, then you'll love my book. Because it's so thin. But yeah, reading is important. And what I've learned as I've gotten older, it strengthens the organ called the brain. Because you get older and it's like there's a bird in the window, you're so easily distracted, right? So you need to strengthen that thing. And there's a goodness about it too, because you have to keep pouring in order to be giving out. And when you read other men, even if you don't agree with them, cause you to think, and to ponder, and to force thought. And so it's important to be readers and to read. You have to read to be a reader. Thank you so much. God bless you.
So much, Pastor Matt. And once again, I know it's getting a little bit later, but like I mentioned, he does have a merchandise table out there, so if you want to try to catch him on the way out, I'm sure they can get some contact information for you. I know he gets emails and questions from people all the time, so if you did have a question that didn't get answered, check that out. Also, don't forget, in the back corner there, as you guys can imagine, it costs some money to bring a guy like this all the way from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So if you found tonight of value, if you're encouraged, we do have an offering basket in the back there to help cover all the expenses for getting Matt and his wife here and all of those things. So please consider that free will offering, and then don't forget to support him at the merchandise table as well. Also, if you enjoyed what he had to say tonight, the next time and place he's going to be speaking is tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at Submerged Church. We meet at Liberty Middle School in West Fargo, so if you want to come hear him again, come and check us out. Good, appropriate name, Liberty Middle School. I just love that. That's where Submerged Church meets, 10 a.m. So come check us out tomorrow. And am I forgetting anything? I think that's it. Yes, oh yeah, and then, yeah, if you are writing a check for a contribution for the offering for the Trewhellas, write it out to Submerged Church. So, thank you again so much for coming out tonight. Blessings to all of you, and let's keep up the fight, the good fight. Amen.
Thank you.